Welcome to Tybee Island. It's a tourist attraction just outside of Savannah, Georgia on Highway 80. The significance of Tybee Island, whereas History on Two Wheels is concerned, is the fact that it hasn't always been a tourist attraction. This is the key point for the taking of Fort Pulaski. During this episode, we'll take a look at the cause and effect of decisions that were made earlier during the Civil War as to how this little bitty island that really amounted to nothing at the time played into the final taking of Fort Pulaski in Savannah, Georgia. In 1861, Tybee Island was considered to be too isolated and not built up enough for any kind of conflict or confrontation between the Union and the Confederate forces. So the Confederates decided to abandon Tybee Island and withdraw the troops that were here and move them to Fort Pulaski, which is, as you could see by the video just a minute ago, just a mere 1,500 yards from this location. Where we're at right now is called Battery Park. The reason it's called Battery Park is that in the earlier part of 1864, the Union decided that they couldn't go up through the tributaries and the smaller creeks and etc. to get to Savannah, so they were going to have to take Fort Pulaski and go in the mainland. The problem was Fort Pulaski was one of the more formidable forts here in the Savannah area, and it was considered to be sort of the granddaddy of all the forts here. Even though it was the first one to fall, they threw more at it from Tybee Island than the Confederates had expected. Along the banks of and the beaches of Tybee here, the Union forces built up 10 artillery batteries along the line facing west to Fort Pulaski. In and of itself, 10 batteries against the fort, if they were using conventional artillery, would have not even made it really a dent. The cannonballs would have just bounced off the walls of the fort, which is all they had when they built the fort or started building the fort in 1829. However, we were looking at 30 some odd years later, and technology had advanced, and the Union forces now had rifled cannons which could shoot projectiles, not just cannonballs. So at that point, it became a different story. On February 13th, the Confederate ship Ida, which would run supplies from Savannah over to Fort Pulaski, was making its regular route down the Savannah River when it came under fire from two of the fortifications that the Union Army had built over on the north side of the river complex. The islands that the Union had taken were on islands such as Venus Point and Pulaski Island. Luck was with the Ida that day because it didn't sustain any damage. As a matter of fact, it ran the gauntlet at full steam, making it to Pulaski. A couple of days later, it took an alternate route and was able to make it back to Savannah. That was the last time that Fort Pulaski actually was able to get resupplied from the Confederates. The Union decided that it was going to run a tight noose around Fort Pulaski in order to basically starve it out. So what they did was they used those two islands and built up fortifications in secret around it, and then put gunboats into Tybee Creek. They also built the 10 gun batteries along the western island beaches facing Fort Pulaski. It was interesting that those batteries were having to be built at night because Fort Pulaski, their guns could reach Tybee, and they were pretty accurate. The records are showing from the Union soldiers that Pulaski's guns were very effective and very accurate. One of the first targeting or ranging shots that were fired onto the Tybee Island batteries was actually lined up and shot by the fort commander, and unbeknownst to him at the time, that very first round actually cut a Union soldier in half. At the same time that they were deploying 2 companies of infantrymen along the beach line here and placing gunboats out in the river, they also cut the telegraph line between Fort Pulaski and Savannah. So at this point, Fort Pulaski was totally 100% on its own. After February 15th, with all communications being severed with Fort Pulaski and Savannah, Fort Pulaski was sealed up and they couldn't get any resupplies or reinforcements. But that also meant the soldiers at Fort Pulaski couldn't get out of Fort Pulaski either. You wouldn't think about it, but with all the communications being severed, Fort Pulaski was now down to having only one form of communication with the outside world, and that was with a swimmer that would swim and walk through the marshes from Fort Pulaski to Savannah and back. Can you imagine having to do this at night in alligator-infested marshes all by yourself? On February 19th, before this order could even reach Union headquarters, General Sherman had already ordered Chief Engineer Quincy Gilmore to Tybee to command all the troops and to prepare the island for the bombardment of Fort Pulaski. After the incident here at Fort Pulaski, Gilmore was later promoted to brigadier and placed in charge of all the Union soldiers' volunteers. These 10 batteries that were built here ranged in distances from here to Fort Pulaski from the 1,500 yards here all the way up the Tybee beach line for 3,400 yards. Now at the time, the conventional wisdom was that smoothbore cannons and cannonballs, anything over 700 yards, would not have much of an effect on 7.5-foot thick brick walls such as Fort Pulaski's. And anything over 1,000 would have no effect at all, except for just making a lot of noise when they hit. But the Union soldiers had one new weapon up their sleeve, and they brought a lot of them. That was called the rifled cannons, and they could shoot not only cannonballs, but they could shoot projectiles such as shells with explosives. They set these explosives to detonate not on impact, but after impact. So when these shells would enter into the walls of Fort Pulaski, they wouldn't explode right away. After they impacted and were embedded in the wall, then they would explode and tear the wall up. They were hoping for a breach of the wall so that the infantry troops could at that point cross the river and enter into the fort through the breached walls. If you'll remember, I said that they had to build the batteries at night in order to keep Fort Pulaski from being able to shoot them. How they did this was they would bring the cannons in by ship just to the edge of the firing line for Fort Pulaski. They would load the cannons and the mortars up on rafts and bring them up during high tide. And during high tide, they could bring them up closer to the shore. Once they did that, they would just simply wait until the low tide, and then all the troops on the island at night would go to work. To move one 13-inch mortar, it would take 250 men at a time working diligently through the night just to move that one mortar. They built 10 batteries here, so you can imagine the massive undertaking at night that it took for them to do this. Meanwhile, at Fort Pulaski, the spotters couldn't see them, they couldn't range them. They were helpless at night to do anything against it. Then during the day, the work from the previous night was camouflaged so that Fort Pulaski couldn't see exactly what they were doing. And this work continued even up to the night prior to the bombardment of Fort Pulaski. That night, all the men were filling cartridge bags, they were cutting fuses, and etc., getting ready for the next day's bombardment of Fort Pulaski. Then over the next 30 hours, once the shooting began, Fort Pulaski was pummeled. During this time, Gilmore sent a message to Fort Pulaski. On the morning of April 10th, Gilmore sent Colonel Olmsted a message to Fort Pulaski asking for his unconditional surrender, trying to save loss of life and property. Colonel Olmsted's reply was, "I'm here to defend the fort, not surrender it." At that point, Gilmore opened fire. Over the next 30 hours, Fort Pulaski became the target of every gun along that line, and there were 36 guns. When Colonel Olmsted finally surrendered the fort, Gilmore crossed over in a dinghy along with his officers and approached the front gate for Fort Pulaski. he was met by Colonel Olmsted and taken to Colonel Olmsted's personal quarters, which you saw in the video for Fort Pulaski. After an hour of being in the colonel's quarters, the colonel requested all of his officers report to his quarters. Over the next brief period of time, every officer surrendered his sword and his weapon with a simple statement: "I surrender my sword. I hope I have not dishonored it." During the fight, not that many rounds actually fell inside the fort, and the few that did just buried themselves in the mud. And then whenever it exploded, it didn't do anything except for throw a lot of mud around. One of the solid shots actually made it through one of the gun holes and unmounted the gun and injured several of the crew, one of which had to have his arm amputated right away. And another one of the shots actually ripped the halyard on the flagpole, and the flag fell down inside the parapet of the compound. Two soldiers immediately ran to it, picked it up, put it on one of the cannon rods, and hoisted it at the angle. And there it stayed for the rest of the fight until the Colonel Olmsted lowered it and put up the white flag asking for a truce. At the end of the first day of battle, if Gilmore had been able to inspect the compound, he would have found that most of one of the walls was whittled down to just 2 feet thick, and most of the guns were dismounted. They only had 2 of the mounted guns still operational, and he could have just kept going for a couple of more hours, and he would have destroyed the fort. It was in total shambles by the time the end of the first day was done. If you know, the battle only lasted 30 hours, and by noon on Friday, all the guns were pretty much directed towards the rampart, and within just a couple of hours, right around noontime, those guns also fell silent. It was at this time that one of the projectiles actually went right through one of the breaches in the wall. It crossed over the parade field and hit the powder house, which held 40,000 pounds of powder. At that point, Colonel Olmsted, being 25 years old at the time, had to make a decision. And it was either stay and fight until the very last man, or save the lives he had and surrender the fort. hope you've enjoyed this episode of Keeping History on Two Wheels. If so, subscribe, like, and share. Also, join us next time, will you, as we take a look at the Charleston Mine.